Welcome to the Dr. Bubs Performance Podcast, giving you the latest evidence-based research and cutting-edge insights for elite mental and physical performance. He's connecting you directly with the world's leading experts and coaches. Here's your host, Dr. Bubs.
Welcome to episode 1 of my new podcast, the Dr. Bubs Performance Podcast. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a naturopathic doctor, sport nutrition lead for Canada Basketball, a strength coach, and the author of the Paleo Project. So why am I starting a podcast? Well, first of all, I enjoy them. I think it's a great place to get valuable information. You can get key tips and insights from experts, and it's a great medium for sharing thoughts and ideas. The tricky part I find, though, is really nailing down how to implement some of these things. And with that in mind, I'm going to attempt to bridge the worlds of nutrition, fitness, functional medicine, and entrepreneurship to help you raise your game. I'm going to try to do that by having guests on who are experts in their field, expert PhDs, athletes, researchers, entrepreneurs, strength coaches, and even musicians and actors to share their stories and insights and give you those actionable items, the 20% that provides 80% of the outcome, the simple foundational things that you can implement right away that are going to provide you with a profound benefit. So hopefully you can take away a few things from each episode, and I'm really excited to get things underway. In episode number 1, I'm going to kick things off with something that's fundamental for your overall health, for your performance, and most definitely for your capacity to burn fat and lose weight. And that's your microbiome. All the bacteria that's in your belly and on your body has a serious impact on all of these factors. And Mike Mutzel, expert functional medicine practitioner, nutritionist, and author of The Belly Fat Effect, is on to walk us through how your diet impacts the biodiversity of your gut, how things like chronic inflammation are impacted by the gut bacteria, and subsequently things like your blood sugar and insulin response, which are huge levers that allow you to burn fat effectively or that are roadblocks that prevent you from breaking down body fat. So there's some great clinical pearls in this episode. I'm going to be listing a summary on the page that hosts this interview. I call them my layups, so the easy, actionable items that you could do tomorrow to really get some benefit. And of course, I've also listed there the performance hacks, the things that are a little bit of a deeper dive in, but that you can start self-experimenting with if you so choose to take your mental or physical performance to the next level. I hope you enjoy. Mike, how are you doing today?
Doing awesome, sir. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I'm really excited to kind of dig into this whole idea around microbiome and gut bacteria. But before we jump in there, can you give us a little bit of your background and how you got into the health and fitness and wellness field?
Sure, Dr. Mark, I'd be happy to. So, yeah, as long as I can remember, I've been interested in just aesthetics and bodybuilding, and was a huge fan back when I was a child. I was like 6 years old, I think, like Jean-Claude Van Damme, all those karate movies, and just Arnold Schwarzenegger. So started lifting weights. My older brothers got me into lifting weights, when I was an early teenager, and then read the Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding and followed folks like Lee Haney back in the day and so forth, and then just got a degree in biology, did the NASM certification in personal training and so forth, and realized that, I wanted to kind of dive a little bit deeper into some of the metabolic aspects of our physiology and so forth. And so pursued a master's degree in nutrition and had aspirations of going to medical school, and started working with an internal medicine doctor in Denver, Colorado. Seeing a lot of his kind of metabolic syndrome, overweight, type clients and so forth. And, realized that, some of these overweight people, that whether it was personal training that I was doing with them or nutrition coaching, they were actually eating less food than I was, and I was much leaner and had a lot more muscle. And I was like totally confused, like, how can this be possible? So I realized that this whole calorie in, calorie out thing was bogus. And this is going back to like 2006. Wow. And then, so I kind of started to kind of question some of the paradigms that we've been, that have been put in our heads for a while. And then one of the medical assistants in the clinic, who was morbidly obese, underwent bariatric surgery, and she ate like crap, Cokes and sodas and Twinkies and just all the junk food, right? So it was like, in my mind, like no surprise that she was overweight. But that being said, she underwent this gastric bypass procedure, and within 2 weeks was off her metformin, her blood sugar medication, and lost a lot of weight very quickly, and then was like an entirely new person within a month. So I love having the degree in biology and knowing how to do research. I was really kind of interested in to dive deeper into how does gastric bypass surgery work? Because to me it was so quick. Even if someone was just like kind of starving themselves, or it was reducing how much food was absorbed, I thought there had to be more to the story. And so I went to University of the Medical School Library in Denver there, and then started researching it. It turns out that gastric bypass surgery changes the microbiome. It changes gut hormones, and so that a lot of
interesting. That's incredible.
Yeah, so that and then I decided, gosh, a lot of doctors don't know this. They're not aware. And actually, I do a lot of, public lecturing to healthcare practitioners and fitness professionals and so forth. And one of the first questions that I ask them is, how does gastric bypass surgery work? And, 9 out of 10 people in the room will raise their hand and say, oh, well, that's an obvious. It restricts how much food people eat. And that's a small mechanism. So, this whole microbiome and the gut hormone story, the so-called incretins, which we can talk about, kind of a category of endocrine hormones that are released from the stomach, play a huge role in our digestive and metabolic physiology. And the good news is we don't have to undergo this very invasive and irreversible procedure known as gastric bypass. We can manipulate these gut hormones naturally through diet, lifestyle, time-based eating and various supplements and so forth. So that kind of started the work of the book that you mentioned in the introduction, the belly fat effect, and so on.
Well, that's always good when we know that there's first places to go instead of going straight under the knife. So that's very encouraging. Exactly. Can you kind of set the tone here for us and describe what the microbiome is, and then maybe talk about some of these hormones like the incretins and how they're influenced by the surgery or even the microbiome?
Yeah, wonderful point. So, I think a lot of your listeners probably have heard of the topic of the microbiome, and that just kind of encapsulates this microbial ecosystem that resides on us and within us. And, it outnumbers, our cells. Estimates used to say 10 to 1. Now we're saying like 5 to 1. But it's a huge ecosystem. And, the thing is, a lot of doctors were not taught about this in medical school, and so I'd do a lot of like online interviews. And Dr. Bubbs, we just had you on the show, which was really awesome. But I interview people, and one NIH-funded researcher, he said, the microbiome is so vast and so important. It's like, medical school students, it's imagine them going through, whether it's naturopathic school, chiropractic school, traditional allopathic medical school, imagine studying the entire body and not learning about the liver. The liver releases glycogen, and it's involved in detoxification.
Fundamental for everything, yeah.
Fundamental, and so it does so much, right? And so it turns out that the microbiome is actually contributes more metabolic functions and DNA and physiology compared to our liver. So it's that active. It's very, very important. But how does it relate to obesity specifically is really kind of the question that people are kind of interested in. Well, it turns out that when you eat a diet rich in processed food, you actually foster the growth of unhealthy bacteria that actually are very efficient at harvesting energy from the food that you eat. So if you look at the stool of an overweight person versus a lean individual and give them an isocaloric, like a calorie matched meal, you'll see that the stool of the overweight person has actually less energy in it. So as humans, we're not 100% efficient like our cars, where you drive them and then the gas tank is empty. There's always a little bit of energy or calorie material in our feces. And it turns out that, the type of bacteria that you have can kind of govern how much caloric material, whether it's carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and so forth, are harvested from the stool. So it turns out that overweight people generally have bacteria that are very efficient at getting every last calorie and macronutrient from the food that they eat. So that's a major point. And we'll talk about how we can reverse that, but I'll just kind of throw a plug out there right now. It's dietary diversity is the key thing. So a broad array of phytonutrients, herbs, botanicals, different types of fibers. It's not just like Wheaties and whole grains. We're talking about radicchio and endive and arugula and broccoli and as many different types and the broad array of vegetables that one can eat will actually increase the diversity and selective growth of different bacteria. So what we're really striving for here is kind of like the take home when it comes to the microbiome is a really diverse ecosystem. And that diversity in the ecosystem really garners a lot of stability on the genomic level, on the enzymatic metabolite level, and overall kind of the ecological system level. And so that's what's really important. And when we have this lack of diversity from just really limited food choices, the standard Western diet and so forth, processed foods, what we have is a relative imbalance in what we know to be called gram-negative endotoxin harboring bacteria. So it turns out that if you were to pull blood from overweight individuals or even from healthy athletes after they were to eat a meal rich in McDonald's or junk food, what you're going to find is high levels of this gram-negative bacterial component called endotoxin. And that's inversely linked with health, right? We know high levels of endotoxin are linked with diabetes, with Alzheimer's disease, with memory loss, with cancer, with autoimmunity. I mean, it's this little bacterial component is actually what will, if you were to perforate your bowel from maybe a severe accident or a knife wound, endotoxin would kill you. Actually, that's what's known as like sepsis in the hospital. So This is a very, validated medical phenomenon. So there's enough bacterial constituents in our GI tract that they would literally kill us. And that's why the gut barrier is so important. So when you have leaky gut induced through diet, through stress, through alcohol, through medications, and these components, these endotoxin components come in, they wreak havoc within our immune system. They drive leptin resistance. They affect insulin signaling. They do a lot of nasty things. And so this is another main mechanism, in addition to the calorie harvesting and energy harvesting that overweight people generally have within their bacteria, is a high level of these endotoxin producing bacteria, which again is really a function of a few things, but it's that lack of bacterial diversity. So the ecosystem is imbalanced, and so then we get things like a predator of sorts, and this predator bacteria, to use the analogy of like maybe a wolf or something, is in disproportion level to the entire ecosystem. So it gets across and it causes a major issue. And so what's really unique is the same foods that induce bacterial diversity and keep the ecosystem robust actually downregulate endotoxin absorption as well. So those are things like nuts and seeds, and a real ancestral based diet actually prevents that. So it's really important, again, to kind of get back to the roots and all the things that you talk about in your book, The Paleo Project, because those are the type of foods that will prevent that.
That's awesome, Mike. I mean, there's a lot of points there I kind of want to circle back to. Now, if we even just back up a second, just say that, the average GP or personal trainer, somebody comes in, if their client has a significant amount of belly fat, can we pretty much assume that there's going to be this dysbiotic bacteria or this lack of bacterial diversity within their microbiome?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, and I think the answer is yes, and I talk about this in the book a lot. So there's a lot of studies that have come out. I mean, these started coming out, Dr. Bubbs, in like 2011, would show independent of all other health parameters, so like C-reactive protein and, fibrinogen and ferritin and other like acute phase reactants, independent of all those inflammatory parameters and so forth, belly fat is linked with imbalanced gut bacteria and even intestinal permeability. So there was one study published in Nature Reviews Obesity. So the Nature publishing group publishes, in my opinion, some of the most reputable science, and they're very stringent about what quality methods and so forth that the scientific authors are submitting. So I really like that publishing group. But yeah, long story short, they've published quite a few studies. These are researchers at, I think, Johns Hopkins, some folks in Italy and France and so forth, that have independently correlated imbalanced gut bacteria and or intestinal permeability with both belly fat, obesity and central obesity, but also specifically, which I think is really cool, triglycerides, elevated blood levels of triglycerides, elevated levels of hemoglobin A1C, fasting glucose, and fasting insulin. So that's the other component too, is a lot of people are coming in with lab work, and so they can, can see it. If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So this whole blood sugar dysregulation, right, is really kind of it starts in the gut. And so again, there's enough data there that we can be very confident in, not having to do a lot of esoteric laboratory tests and, looking at like the GI map test and trying to figure out which bacteria are elevated or not. We can really just look at these traditional and readily accessible metabolic and, anthropomorphic parameters and kind of see what's going on in the intestine that way.
Yeah, I mean, that's great, because we can really, on this topic, you can really go down the rabbit hole, can't you, in terms of all the specifics and all the pathways and the different signaling pathways that are involved. And then at the end of the day, when we'll kind of circle back to to dietary interventions and changes that people can make. It can actually be quite simple in terms of helping to reverse things. But talk to us a little bit about this idea of the impact of the microbiome on blood sugar response to meals or on insulin function. What impact does that play if we've got a more dysbiotic, somebody who's overweight, belly fat, a more dysbiotic microbiome?
Yeah, wonderful point. Well, first of all, it comes again from that endotoxin. So that endotoxin and this is a new way of looking at the origin of insulin resistance and leptin resistance. We generally think that the macronutrient imbalances within the diet and then the absorption therein within the serum are shifting that. Like when we have a high glycemic meal, it's going to release a lot of insulin, and then the receptors are going to say, hey, no, insulin, what are you doing? And they're going to become down regulated and desensitized. But what we know actually happens first, well, there's two things we'll talk about, kind of the endotoxin and then the gut hormones. But what it turns out is when you have this endotoxin material, it triggers inflammatory pathways. And so we know these things called cytokines, these little mediators that the immune system uses to communicate signals, things like TNF alpha and interleukin 6 and interferon gamma and all these, there's a whole myriad of these different cytokines. They actually are kind of the genesis and kind of the upstream of inducing insulin resistance. And so we know that insulin resistance at some level is really fundamentally inflammatory based. And so this is why when people sit all day, they become, there's a low grade of inflammation, and that affects the insulin receptor signaling. We know that if we talked about sepsis in the hospital, if you have trauma or something, it's actually the cytokine that's very widely recognized called TNF alpha. You can measure it in your bloodstream. It used to be called cachectin because it would induce cachexia and muscle wasting. This was its first name back in the 1940s. And it also induced insulin resistance. That's kind of interesting. So we need to I would love for practitioners and coaches listening to this, think about inflammation is upstream of insulin resistance. And so if someone is having blood sugar dysregulation, they're on blood sugar lowering medications and so forth, we really need to look at the inflammatory components in their diet, in their lifestyle, the foods that they're eating, and also the integrity of their microbiome. Because if these bacterial particulates are coming across, they're going to affect this whole insulin pathway and also leptin pathway as well. So the food cravings will be there. The blood sugar.
I'll jump in there because I want to sort of tie this up a little bit for people, and then because leptin's going to be a big part of that, which is great that you're jumping in there. But so this idea that if we do have a client who's in front of us, high belly fat, we can effectively say that there's going to be dysbiosis and there's going to be this level of systemic inflammation, which, as you mentioned, is this driving factor behind the insulin dysfunction. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah. So you can induce insulin resistance by injecting TNF alpha or endotoxin into the bloodstream. So yeah, awesome point there.
Terrific. So now you're going to add another layer on, which is this idea of cravings and how bacteria can even influence cravings. So yeah, talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, this is another interesting component of the whole, digestive physiology and so forth. So when just the thought of eating food or the smell of food and cooking food and chewing food releases a lot of these different hormones from the GI tract itself. So, it makes a lot of sense that, the gut is the first contact point that food has within the body. So it would make sense that it would send these messages to communicate to the rest of the body to say, hey, guys, we have food coming in. Just, be warm, be ready and so forth. And so it turns out that, this category of endocrine hormones called the incretin hormones. There's 26 different hormones. They have a lot of funky little names like GLP-1 and CCK and PYY and GLP-2. And there's a lot of these different hormones, but they actually in turn affect, they'll tell the pancreas to release insulin, and then they'll tell the muscle cells to be sensitive to insulin's message. They'll tell the brain, that we need to eat more, we need to eat less. There's receptors in the heart for GLP-1 and PYY and these other hormones that affect heart contractility and the inflammatory response. They do a lot of different things. And it's no surprise that the drug companies now, their whole new pipeline of medications are going after this whole incretin axis. So
gotcha.
You'll see medications like GLP-1 agonists and DPP-4, which is an enzyme. They're called DPP-4 inhibitors, and they actually inhibit the breakdown of the gut hormones. And guess what? That bariatric surgery that we talked about is a major driver through which these gut hormones are increased. And people always ask, like, why or how? Well, it turns out that when you kind of restructure the intestines and you're sending food right from the esophagus to the duodenum, so you take the stomach out of the picture, it's like, taking a microphone to your ear. And if someone says, I can't hear you, the message is so overpowering for that desensitized stomach that's been, kind of resistant to the messages because the food was unhealthy and didn't have the phytonutrients and so forth, and the bacteria was off. So the message is amplified. It's so strong that the small intestine is now releasing super physiologic levels of these gut hormones, these incretin hormones.
Wow.
So then we get the blood sugar reduction. Actually, incidentally, this is what really got me excited, Dr. Mark, is a paper, I think it was Nature Reviews Endocrinology and Metabolism, if I'm not mistaken, but talked about how insulin dependent, so these are full-blown type 2 diabetics, they've been pushing the needle at both ends, eating junk food, and their blood sugar is so dysregulated, they need exogenous insulin to maintain homeostasis in their metabolic physiology. They no longer need insulin after undergoing bariatric surgery within 12 hours. So this is how
Incredible.
quick.
Wow.
Keep in mind, they're getting TPN, right? They're not really eating food like a traditional diet 12 hours after the surgery. So this is very powerful stuff. But interestingly, in that same article that really talked about how great bariatric surgery is for reducing restoring normal insulin physiology, they also said, well, there's a lot of natural ways that we can mimic this hormonal effect without having to undergo the procedure. So that's the thing I'd like to let people know about. So some of the things, we can kind of talk about, just eating breakfast actually increases your gut hormones. So I know there's a lot of different ideas out there with intermittent fasting and time-restricted feeding and so forth, but I think you and I agree with this. Breakfast is one of these kind of keystone meals, and it kind of sets the tone for the day. And there's a lot of evidence to support kind of the mechanisms through which breakfast functions. And it turns out that breakfast eaters compared to non-breakfast eaters have higher levels of these gut hormones. So the GLP-1s, the CCKs, all these hormones that, again, the drug companies are trying to go after and artificially increase through pharmaceutical compounds. So
definitely.
exercise.
Breakfast is definitely one of those key ones. And I think making the right choices for a lot of people is obviously the tricky part, because the average, Western or North American, even European breakfast can be very high carbohydrate, high sugar, etc. Now I know, some of the easy wins might be, and you can confirm this for us, just simply reducing sugar intake of meals or breakfast meals overall. Reducing carbohydrate intake tends to have a good, at least in the initial period, impact on shifting, gut bacteria and improving that dysbiotic bacteria. Are those, some simple strategies that, trainers or GPs could think about first?
Yeah, exactly. And it turns out that these good fats, so this is one of the mechanisms through which this kind of low carb, this ketogenic style diet and even a paleo diet works is, these receptors that affect the gut hormones and then in turn affect our appetite and blood sugar regulation. They love, fats and different types of protein, different types of fiber. So it's really like, we're understanding kind of the mechanisms through which an ancestral style diet works. And it turns out it's through affecting, like we talked about, the gut hormones and also the gut bacteria. So yeah, those simple carbohydrates, they really don't, white breads and sugars and croissants and whatever else, they don't tend to amplify these gut hormones. They tend to just kind of go along through, and the receptors don't really recognize them. They're absorbed as kind of sugar and so forth, and fermented by the microbiome, and don't really increase short chain fatty acids in these healthy things. So it turns out that you need a little bit more complexity and to your diet. And again, a simple thing is just cook your food from scratch, right? Avocado, eggs, nut seeds, and I know you talk about them a lot in your book, and recipes and so forth. So it turns out that diet sends the right messages to the gut.
And that can be pretty quick too. I mean, people are used to sort of eating, eggs is definitely one. I mean, the medical system, we've scared people off consuming eggs, but definitely that's a nice breakfast option. And I guess when you look at even, again, the Western diet, I mean, it's such high carbohydrate choices first thing in the morning, breakfast cereals, granolas, orange juice, that you sort of, it's not a big surprise that we're in this problem in the first place when you just talked about all the influences on insulin signaling and leptin and these endotoxemia and predator bacteria just by having this higher carbohydrate, higher processed food diet. And it's basically 3/4 of the population are, that's how they start their day. So that's definitely an area where, getting that lower carb breakfast sounds like a pretty nice solution. Now, you were just about to jump into some exercise there before I cut you off there. Now, can you talk to us a little bit about how exercise would impact this microbiome for that average client trying to shift some belly fat?
Sure, I would love to, and I'll just do a little sidestep to cap off that discussion. Is also researchers at Duke University have talked about, they've looked at different types of proteins. So we know a lot of people like smoothies for breakfast, and I agree with you, Dr. Mark. I think the eggs and the avocado and real food is a staple. But for people that are traveling, they're on the road, they have a limited time in the morning. just be aware of this research at Duke University. They've actually shown that pea protein and whey protein compared to other proteins. So they looked at soy, they looked at fish, they looked at meat protein from animals. And what they found is that whey protein and pea protein, this is good news, guys, it actually increases these gut hormones and affects the incretin axis. So if you are short on time or you're getting sick of eggs and bacon and avocado or whatever, you can throw in a protein shake here and there, but just make sure to add in a little bit of the veggies and the fiber and so forth, because that will help with the bacteriodiversity and so on. But
that's a great comment, because a lot of people forget to add the protein to that breakfast smoothie. It ends up being a lot of other things, but they sort of forget that protein and fat. So that's fantastic to know that it's going to help set things up on the microbiome side of things as well.
Yeah, it's huge. There's a lot of natural juiceries in Toronto and other major cities. And I go, a lot of people think they're doing themselves a favor by having juice. It's alkaline, there's phytonutrients. But I look at these juices, and oftentimes the first ingredient, and folks should look out for this, is the Granny Smith apple, which is the sweetest and the most high sugar apple. So if you're going to have just like a vegan style diet, try and throw in the pea protein, because that is, vegan, vegetarian friendly, but it does have, those amino acids that affect this gut hormone level and so on.
Perfect. Great suggestion.
Yeah. So exercise, it's really unique. A lot of folks know this anecdotally. After they exercise, they're not as hungry. We do know that it's good to get amino acids and BCAAs and so forth to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. But one of the mechanisms that kind of may affect our blood sugar transiently after exercise in a good way, rebalance that, and also affect our appetite and reduce the inflammatory response, researchers have shown the mechanism there is actually increasing these gut hormones. So it turns out that it's the more intense and the short duration, like interval style training, the higher levels of these gut hormones. So they've looked at, there's a few studies, I haven't looked at this in the last 6 months or so, but a lot of it is in the book Belly Fat Effect. And so mostly this short duration, high intensity interval style training dramatically increases these gut hormones. And so that's one of the, again, yet another mechanism that we understand. We know that exercise, and I'm sure you've talked about it on the show, increases mitochondrial biogenesis and fat burning and all that. But, the gut hormones are another key point. So a great way, again, to talking about like easy, kind of targets, if you will, or lifestyle modalities that people can do right now. And we talked about this before, when I interviewed you, Dr. Mark, is getting out and getting some activity first thing in the morning. And that can be intense yoga, because that's kind of a burst of sorts. That can be walking on a treadmill, doing some sprints, biking to work, walking to work, just doing something to get moving, I think is really important. So, when you set the stage for the day of getting these gut hormones high, there tends to be kind of like the effects they last throughout the day, which is really important. So you tend to make better food choices as the day goes on, because your blood sugar regulation is in a tighter window. So we know that, the delta, the change between, your baseline level and then the post-meal level, we want that to be as minimal as possible. So when the delta is really high, you go from, say, 85, to 160, then you get all these counter-regulatory hormones, the cortisol, the adrenaline, and then that affects, your whole day, your whole mental outlook, food preference throughout the day. So by doing these small things, eating breakfast, getting movement, you're changing the gut hormones so that, the peak and the trough, if you will, of your blood sugar is not so exaggerated.
Right? Yeah, that's a great one, because, especially when we talk about interval-based training, it's so effective for fat burning, EPOC, VO2 max, even heart health, but we tend to almost forget about the, like you mentioned, this amazing impact on gut hormones and how that plays out in terms of cravings throughout the day and the trickle down effect on gut and immunity and everything else. So it's great. I think that client, that one trying to lose 20 or 30 pounds that has all the some belly fat to shift, they are often the ones that are on the treadmill doing the 30, 45, 60 minutes at a steady pace and struggling to make that progress. So I think that's, for the GPs, again, trainers out there, making sure we're shifting them over to that has just got so many foundational benefits. It's terrific.
Yeah.
Now, if we shift over a little bit to more of the, elite athlete, if you will, or even just, you're really avid exerciser. I know you come from an endurance exercise background, so I think that's where, typically consumption of, simple sugars, on a performance side of things, that's typically, recommendation number one to reach the top of the podium. So how does that impact the microbiome of our endurance athletes, both recreational and, more elite?
Yeah, we kind of talked about it a little bit, but it just doesn't have the diversity or the array of different complex, fibers and phytonutrients. So that's kind of the main mechanism. But, I think, if you're an endurance athlete or you're working with them, what you notice is the high carbohydrate eaters generally tend to have, not as much muscle mass and a little bit more body fat. And so what I found in kind of the weekend warrior types, and we talked about this, so I was living in Boulder, Colorado. This at the time, and I think it still is, kind of the endurance mecca of the world. A lot of Australians and Europeans and so forth would train there, because you're training at high altitude and so forth.
Yeah.
And this was in 2006, right when I first started getting into this paleo diet thing. And Lauren Cordain, actually, he's from Fort Collins, so just 100 miles away or whatever. So, I got into this research, and so that's when I started the paleo diet, kind of thing. And so my carbohydrate base was more like yams and butternut squash, and more of kind of a higher fat, high protein, lower carb style diet. And you can perform at a very high level eating that way, and you actually stay very lean, which is advantageous for anyone doing kind of an endurance sport, because the power to weight ratio is a big thing, whether it's swimming or biking or running, whatever. And so what we find is that when carbohydrate, really carb adapted athletes, they generally tend to have a higher level of body fat, which is not good. So, I think the thing that people just need to be honest with themselves and realize that, when you're doing high intensity type work, use the carbohydrate like you would use caffeine or some sort of other substance before and after. But really, if you're getting most of your caloric material from good protein, good fats, and a small amount of more complex fiber rich carbohydrates, you're going to be okay. And so that's what, it takes some experimentation. You have to have time and so forth to adapt, but I think that's kind of the best thing for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think you nailed it right there, because here at the clinic, I'm downtown Toronto, and we get a lot of guys who maybe used to be runners, but now they've dovetailed into cycling, and they're logging a lot of kilometers in a week, and their performance is up, but some of these guys are holding on to 10, 20, 30 pounds of belly fat and extra weight, and that's when you start to think to yourself, you mentioned that power to weight ratio, and just rethinking how we're going to fuel during some of these rides, because that over reliance on simple carbs, if you're still 20 pounds overweight, is not going to be your best strategy. Just finding that middle ground, like you mentioned, is really key. Now, how about in terms of team sport athletes, or is there implications there? I know things like plane travel is a big one for professional athletes, whether it's the NBA or Major League Baseball. Things like circadian rhythms, plane travel, does that impact the microbiome?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of research there. So there's this crosstalk and correlation there. So we need to make sure that we're blocking that artificial light and trying to, get up and rise at the same time daily. That's another big thing. And this time of year, when it's, days are really short, getting some beeswax, style candles, putting them around the house so that you're not having artificial light and stuff, I think is a huge thing. But there's a lot of crosstalk between the microbiome and circadian rhythms, and one influences the other. So that's I have a friend of mine from the UK that is a high-level jiu-jitsu and karate double black belt in both, and so
Wow.
He actually uses food to entrain his body's circadian rhythm. So, for example, if he's going from the UK to San Francisco, right, he's going a few days before, he's going to start eating his foods that would be commensurate with the time in San Francisco, and that will actually induce his circadian rhythm. So whether it's the microbiome, the gut hormones, or whatever, but there is this crosstalk. And so it's really, and I travel, coast to coast quite frequently, from Seattle to Toronto, Vancouver to Toronto, New York, wherever. And I've implemented his, Alessandro's philosophy there, and it's really helped me with adapting to different time zones. So I think athletes could do that as well. And again, you got to minimize the inputs, the light, and so forth. Getting first morning light is one of the best ways to re-entrain your body's circadian rhythm, but obviously the food plays a huge role. So just, if you're going to be playing or participating in some event, just start to eat on that time zone as whatever. Let's say you eat breakfast at 8 a.m. and then lunch or a snack at 1 and then dinner early at 6 or whatever. Just skew that a little bit so that you're eating within that time zone. And surprisingly, when you travel, you'll notice that you feel less fatigued, you're more energetic, and you've kind of realigned your body's rhythm. So I think that's another huge kind of little rock, if you will, that you can move out of the way and accelerate your performance.
Yeah, that's a great recommendation, even for the busy executives or whomever is doing the plane travel, hopping from one city to the next is another fantastic strategy to just get into that time zone a little bit quicker, so you can stay sharp mentally as well if you're having to work and perform on that side of things.
Right.
Terrific. Now, also around the gut health, I mean, we see this a lot in football and ice hockey, the reliance on painkillers and NSAIDs in particular. You touched on the microbiome and how a dysbiotic bacteria can influence things like leaky gut. Can you bring the NSAIDs into the picture? Are they helping or hurting, or what's the impact there?
Yeah, that's an awesome point. They are definitely hurting. So that's a challenge. A lot of these, whether it's endomethacin or ibuprofen and all these compounds, they really perturb the lining and weaken the integrity of the gut, which is not a good thing. And so when that happens, we're actually, well, this is kind of a sidestep, but this is early research actually shows that the gut has a lot of mitochondria and participates in whole body fat burning, and it's really active. And when we think about processing all this nutrients and squeezing and the peristaltis and all that, there's a lot of activity going on, and these NSAIDs and other compounds like PPIs and so forth actually may be at the cellular level destroying the mitochondria within the gut that powers the motility and so forth. So that's not good, obviously, for malabsorption and indigestion and also slow release of these gut hormones. So we need to look at more, and here's as just a sidestep, but I'll circle right back. As we get more fat adapted, actually our baseline levels of inflammation go down. Our body's more efficient. There's not as much oxidative stress and cellular mediators that drive the inflammatory process. And actually a good proxy for inflammation is heart rate variability. What a lot of people will notice if they start testing their baseline heart rate variability, there's a great app called HRV for training. There's the Heart Math Institute. They have a wonderful biofeedback device. But, suffice it to say, I mean, when you start restricting the carbs, getting more fat adapted, your HRV, your heart rate variability improves, which is positive. That shows that you're really in that more digest and rest and parasympathetic branch of your autonomic nervous system. So that's a really good thing. So, the bottom line is that these drugs, these compounds, they do affect the gut at a negative level, but you may not need to take these compounds if you are more of a fat adapted type athlete, because your baseline level of inflammation is going to be reduced or attenuated, right? So you're not going to have as many aches and pains. Like we can avoid the trauma associated with sport, but if your baseline level is lower, the recovery is going to be faster. And so that's one of the things that I've personally noticed is recovery, that delayed onset muscle soreness, the DOMS associated with weight training and so forth. That isn't as bad for me anymore, even though I really push it in the gym and fail at 6 to 8 reps and
wow.
Superset and all that. You don't get that, oh my gosh, I can barely move my legs kind of thing after a hard leg day. So it's really interesting. You're still causing that adaptation. You're still causing those muscles to the adaptation involved in hypertrophy and all that. But because your level of inflammation is lower, your heart rate variability is improved. You're kind of steady state in that parasympathetic branch of your nervous system. Things are better. So again, this is one of the advantages of kind of eating this way, getting these gut hormones high, and getting out some of these simple carbs, because they're really inflammatory, on a cellular level, and they can. Again, so then you become reliant upon these medicines that have a huge impact, So we talked about endotoxin, that gets absorbed. And so an easy way to cause metabolic endotoxemia is to take ibuprofen before you eat a meal, because you're damaging the small intestine, and that's going to let these bacterial particulate in. So yeah, definitely, obviously, if you need them, you rolled your ankle or whatever.
Short term's okay for a couple days if you need them.
Exactly, and pair them with zinc carnosine. So this is a nutrient that's been studied in Japan for H. pylori and ulcers and so forth. It's a form of zinc that seems to have a reparative effect and can kind of ameliorate some of the downside associated with endomethacin and ibuprofen and all these other NSAIDs.
Because we even see some weekend warriors who things are getting bad when they start popping the Advils before ibuprofens before the training session. I mean, that's we know that training itself is going to induce some damage to the gut. Some stress to the gut as well. So that's obviously a big no-no, right?
Big no-no. And you want that adaptation. So that's the other thing. I mean, I can't remember specific studies, but I have read some headlines on Science Daily and things like that where, if people take antioxidants after exercise, guess what? Well, you actually reduce the efficacy of the exercise. So you want that signaling. And so I think training with trying to reduce the signaling is not going to be adaptive for your training. And so, yeah, you definitely, I think that's a terrible idea on multiple levels.
For sure. That's definitely, you're going down the wrong path if you notice yourself doing that. Last one here would be great before we have to wrap things up. What about sleep? The impacts, people now are not getting enough sleep. I think we're averaging less than 6.5 hours, and about a third of the population are less than 6 per night. So what is that doing to the microbiome?
Yeah, this is huge, So it turns out, like pretty much like we talked about, every single thing, that we do, whether it's exercise, stress too much, not eat the right foods, it affects the microbiome and obviously our physiology. But sleep is a big one. But it does affect all these hormones that we talked about, in even leptin too. So you're going to have more cravings, you're going to have blood sugar dysregulation. So sleep is a major kind of puzzle piece in this whole equation. But it's not just getting the 8 hours. It's also how are you breathing while you're sleeping. And people might think that's a little bizarre, but I've been, really kind of helping people to better understand this nose breathing versus mouth breathing. And while you're getting your deep REM sleep, if you're breathing through your mouth, what your tongue is actually doing is temporarily becoming paralyzed, and the muscle relaxes on your airways. So you're having these short episodes of hypoxic type events, which can, even though you're in deep sleep, theoretically, but if you're unable to breathe, it's going to be interrupted sleep. So
for sure.
One little tip is get people to tape their mouth shut before they go to bed. So you get, at Shoppers or Walgreens or Rite Aid.
That's fantastic.
Yeah,
I like
Dr.
that.
Markham, it works amazingly. I can't tell you. I mean, this is one of the things that I have been there's a lot of things that have changed my life from a diet, functional medicine perspective in the last 10 years. This is the number one thing that I would not give up. And
I'm thinking a lot of wives and partners out there just can't wait to slap on a duct tape over their partner's mouth before bedtime, just to get some peace and quiet.
Yeah, it's so funny. But yeah, so it forces you to breathe through your nose, and the dreams, the mental recall, the energy when you wake up. And speaking of heart rate variability, that's improved blood sugar regulation, keto adaptation. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So I think, definitely make sleep a priority. Like it's your job. You show up at 9, you leave at 5 or whatever, but make sure that you're getting to bed at the same time every night, and then try to do that mouth taping thing so you're breathing through your nose. And if you can't breathe through your nose, that's really a symptom of sleep disordered breathing. So you need to figure out what that is. Is it food allergies? Is it alcohol use? Is it too much dairy and cheese consumption? Is it mold in your home? You need to figure that out, because that's affecting your deep quality sleep, and which will in turn affect your metabolism, your risk of cancer, your microbiome, and all that. So mouth taping is a huge tip.
Yeah, it's amazing how it's all connected in terms of, what we eat and how we move and all these lifestyle factors just really playing into, how well we look, feel, and perform, and, of course, how sharp we are mentally and everything else. So, Mike, this has been phenomenal. I mean, thanks so much for carving out some time today to join us. You're an absolute wealth of information, which is fantastic. Your book, A Belly Fat Effect, is phenomenal. I encourage everyone to check that out. And if people want to, connect with you on the interwebs, where's the best place to get a hold of you?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Bubbs. The best place is probably highintensityhealth.com. So I do a video podcast and some blogging there. Also on YouTube, High Intensity Health, and then my Facebook is Mike Mutzel MS. So do post 2 to 3 times a day. A lot of more science-based stuff. So if people like the tone of this discussion and kind of the level of detail, they'll like some of the things that we share over there.
That's great for sure. You could get down that rabbit hole and really give the full explanation. So awesome, Mike. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks everyone else for tuning in. Check us out at Dr. Bubbs on Twitter and Facebook. Give us a 5-star rating on iTunes and join our monthly email newsletter at drbubbs.com. Thanks so much for joining us. Bye for now.
The Dr. Bubbs Performance Podcast endeavors to provide accurate and helpful information to listeners. These podcasts cannot take into account individual circumstances and are not intended to be a substitute for health and medical advice from a qualified health professional. You should always seek the advice of a qualified health professional before acting on any of the information provided by any of the Dr. Bubbs Performance Podcasts.